Min-Seok Kim is a billionaire mafia boss, a cold and calculating man who has built his empire through ruthlessness. He is a man who has rejected everyone, believing that power, money, and control are all that matter. Within the first few moments, the high-paced world of Min-Seok comes crashing down. His step-siblings, Tae-ho and Yoon-jae Park, have orchestrated a plan to sabotage his car, causing a ghastly accident. This triggers a save-the-cat moment as Min-Seok is left in a vulnerable state, suffering from amnesia and completely dependent on a stranger, Aaliyah Carter, a compassionate black nurse who finds him lying injured and homeless, her flashlight beam cutting through the rain, landing on Min-Seok's unconscious face. She looks horrified but determined. This starts a journey of healing, and the mastermind behind Min-Seok Kim's ghastly accident. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Seoul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comment section and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's continue with the story. The rain drummed a rhythmic, relentless beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park family's private lounge, overlooking the neon-soaked skyline of Seoul. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of storm, one made of silent ambition and cold-blooded greed. Tae-ho Park stood by the mahogany bar, his lean, athletic frame silhouetted against the city lights. He wore a dark turtleneck that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room, his angular face illuminated only by the amber glow of the whiskey swirling in his glass. Beside him, Yoon-jae Park sat perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, her black blazer sharp and imposing, her posture as upright and polished as a blade. "It's done," Tae-ho murmured, a small, predatory smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need to raise his voice. In the quiet of their shared malice, even a whisper felt like a shout. He thought of the mechanic he had bribed, a man who knew exactly how to make a brake line look like it had simply perished under the stress of a high-speed journey. The agility in Tae-ho's movements as he paced the room suggested a man who had finally outmaneuvered a giant. He turned to his sister, his eyes twinkling with the smugness of a predator who had just closed the trap. Yoon-jae didn't return the smile immediately. Her delicate features remained neutral, her calculating intellect already 3 steps ahead, imagining the legal paperwork that would follow the tragedy. She smoothed the lapel of her blazer, her gaze distant yet sharp. "Min-Seok is meticulous," she cautioned, her voice a smooth, dangerous silk. "If he suspects even a tremor of betrayal before he hits the mountain road, we lose everything." She looked up at her brother, her expression shifting into a polite but cunning edge. "He believes he is the only one fit to hold the inheritance. He thinks our blood is diluted because we are steps. Tonight, we show him that diluted blood can still drown a king." Across the city, in a penthouse that felt more like a fortress, Min-Seok Kim was preparing for the journey that his siblings had turned into a death trap. He moved with a stern, authoritative grace, his strong build filling out a navy suit that had been tailored to perfection. Every movement was calculated, every thought focused on the business expansion awaiting him at the end of this drive. He checked his reflection in the mirror, his chiseled jawline set in its usual mask of serious, unyielding stone. To the world, and even to himself, he was untouchable. He was the sleeping lion of the Kim Empire, a man who viewed the warmth of trust as a dangerous liability. He reached for his car keys, his piercing eyes lingering for a moment on a framed photograph of his late father. He felt the weight of the billion-dollar legacy on his shoulders, a burden he carried with grim pride. He didn't know that the very vehicle waiting in the garage below had been transformed into a coffin of steel and glass. He didn't know that the siblings he had dismissed as mere annoyances were currently toasting to his demise. Back in the lounge, Tae-ho raised his glass toward his sister. "To the king," he mocked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Yoon-jae finally let her smile widen, a graceful but chilling expression of triumph. She stood up, her slender frame exuding a newfound power. "To the inheritance," she corrected. The sound of Min-Seok's engine roaring to life echoed through the secure parking garage blocks away. He pulled out into the rain, the navy suit pristine, his dark hair sleek and polished, his mind focused on a future that was being erased with every rotation of his tires. As he accelerated toward the mountain pass, the Park siblings sat in the dark, waiting for the phone call that would tell them the king had finally fallen. They remained poised and elegant in their cruelty, two serpents watching the clock, smiling at the chaos they had set in motion. The mountain road was a serpent of wet asphalt, coiling around the jagged cliffs of Seoul's outskirts. Inside his luxury sedan, Min-Seok Kim sat enveloped in the scent of expensive leather and the soft hum of a high-performance engine. He drove with a cold, focused intensity, his piercing eyes fixed on the road ahead as the rain lashed against the windshield like 1,000 tiny needles. He was a man who believed he controlled every variable, every outcome. But as he crested the highest peak of the pass and pressed the pedal to navigate a sharp, descending turn, the illusion of control vanished. The brake pedal went limp beneath his foot. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the rain. Then, the world transformed into a violent, deafening kaleidoscope of shrieking metal and shattering glass. The car, once a symbol of his absolute power, became a steel trap as it punched through the guardrail and plummeted into the darkness of the ravine. Min-Seok's last conscious thought was not of his billions or his empire, but of the cold, mocking smiles of Tiho and Yoonjae, the snakes he had allowed into his home. Then, the impact silenced everything. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the mangled engine and the steady drip of gasoline. Min-Seok lay draped over the steering wheel, his navy suit torn and soaked in a mixture of rainwater and the dark blood seeping from the gash on his forehead. To any passerby, he was no longer a billionaire. He was a ghost in the wreckage, a nameless casualty of the storm. A few hundred yards away, Aaliyah Carter was driving her modest hatchback, her eyes tired from a grueling double shift at the city hospital. The blue medical scrubs she wore felt heavy with the exhaustion of the day, but her spirit remained bright, anchored by the natural compassion that had led her to nursing. As she rounded the bend, her headlights caught the jagged gap in the guardrail. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't hesitate. She pulled over, grabbed her emergency kit and a heavy flashlight, and scrambled down the muddy embankment. The wreckage was a horrific sight. The car was unrecognizable, a twisted carcass of black metal resting against a cluster of ancient pines. Aaliyah's breath came in short, jagged bursts as she approached the driver's side. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom until it landed on the man inside. He was pale, his chiseled jawline slack and his eyes closed in a terrifyingly deep unconsciousness. The blood from his head wound was a vivid, shocking red against his white shirt. Aaliyah reached through the shattered window, her white-gloved hand trembling slightly as she searched for a pulse. For a moment, she found nothing. Then, a faint, thready beat fluttered against her fingertips, a tiny spark of life refusing to go out. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the dark. "You're not alone." She worked with a slim but strong efficiency, her professional instincts taking over the fear. As she struggled to stabilize his head and neck, she looked for any sign of who he was. There was no wallet in sight, no phone, only the remnants of a man who looked like he had fallen from a great height. To Aaliyah, he wasn't a mafia boss or a billionaire. He was a human being in a state of total vulnerability, a homeless soul left to die in the dirt. She knew that if she waited for an ambulance in this remote area, he wouldn't survive the night. His breath was becoming shallow, his body temperature dropping in the freezing rain. With a strength born of desperation and grace, she managed to ease him from the seat, supporting his heavy, athletic frame as she guided him toward her car. Every step was a battle against the mud and the dark, but Aaliyah refused to let go. As she laid him across her backseat and covered him with a thermal blanket, she caught a glimpse of his face in the interior light. Even through the blood and the trauma, there was a lingering air of authority in his features, a ghost of the power he had once wielded. But his eyes remained shut, his memory a blank slate wiped clean by the betrayal of his own blood. Aaliyah climbed into the driver's seat, her mind made up. She wouldn't take him to the public hospital, where the sharks might find him. She would take him home. She would be the one to heal the man the world had tried to erase. The hatchback pulled away from the cliffside, leaving the ruined symbol of Min-Seok's old life behind in the mud. As the rain continued to fall, the billionaire was gone, and the sleeping lion began his long, quiet journey into the care of a woman whose kindness he had never imagined possible. The transition from the cold, violent darkness of the ravine to the soft, amber glow of Aaliyah's guest room was a journey across two different worlds. When Min-Seok finally drifted back toward consciousness, it wasn't the roar of an engine or the scream of twisting metal that greeted him, but the faint, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the scent of lavender and antiseptic. He lay perfectly still for a long time, his body feeling heavy, as if it were made of lead. His athletic frame, usually taut with the tension of a man who commanded an empire, was now deeply embedded in the softness of a worn mattress. He slowly opened his eyes, but the authority that usually burned in his piercing gaze was gone, replaced by a haunting, vacant glassiness. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns in the plaster, waiting for a name, a face, or a memory to surface. Nothing came. It was as if a thick, impenetrable fog had rolled over his mind, erasing every trace of the man who had once been the king of Seoul's underworld. "You're awake," a soft, steady voice murmured from the bedside. Min-Seok's head turned slowly, his movement hindered by the thick bandages wrapped around his forehead. He saw a woman sitting in a wooden chair nearby, her slim but capable form silhouetted against the morning light filtering through the curtains. Aaliyah Carter watched him with an expression of profound relief, her gentle facial features illuminated by a warmth that Min-Seok couldn't comprehend. She had traded her blue medical scrubs for a simple sweater, but the stethoscope still peeked out from her bag on the table, a reminder of the profession that had led her to him. "Where?" Min-Seok started, his voice a dry, raspy ghost of the commanding tone he once possessed. He tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of pain shot through his temple, forcing him back against the pillows. "Easy," Aaliyah said, moving quickly to his side. She placed a gentle, cool hand on his shoulder, a touch that felt alien yet strangely grounding to him. "You're safe. You were in a very bad accident. I found you by the mountain pass and brought you here. I'm Aaliyah, I'm a nurse." Min-Seok looked at her, his dark, wavy hair falling over the edge of his bandages. He searched her eyes for a sign of recognition, for a hint of who he was supposed to be to her, but he found only compassion. "Who am I?" he whispered, the question hanging heavy in the quiet room. Aaliyah felt a pang of deep sorrow for the man before her. Even in this broken state, his chiseled jawline and the sharp cast of his features spoke of a life of high status, yet he was now as vulnerable as a child. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I couldn't find any identification at the crash site. No phone, no wallet. For now, you're just my guest." He closed his eyes, a flicker of fear crossing his stern face. In the void where his memory should have been, there was only a terrifying silence. He didn't remember the billion-dollar inheritance, the Navy suits, or the cold-blooded betrayal of Taeho and Yoonjae. He didn't remember that he was a man feared by thousands. To himself, he was a nameless shadow, a blank slate. "Do you remember anything at all?" Aaliyah asked, her voice a soothing anchor in the midst of his internal storm. "A name, a place, a face." Min-Seok struggled, his brow furrowing as he tried to pierce the fog. For a split second, a flash of fire and the sound of a mocking laugh flickered in his mind, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He shook his head slowly. "Nothing, it's all gone." Aaliyah reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm, a stark contrast to the icy rain that had almost claimed him. "Don't force it. The doctors at the clinic I consulted said that with a head injury like yours, memory can be a shy thing. It might come back in pieces or it might take time. But you have a place to stay and you have someone to look after you." Min-Seok looked down at their joined hands, her deep brown skin against his pale, bruised knuckles. In his old life, he would have viewed such a connection as a weakness, a liability to be avoided. But in the vacuum of his amnesia, Aaliyah was the only thing that felt real. She was the person who had pulled him from the wreckage when he was a homeless soul with nothing to offer. "Why?" he asked, his voice stronger now but still laced with confusion. "Why help a stranger who has nothing?" Aaliyah gave him a small, natural smile that reached her eyes. "Because you were hurting and I could help. That's enough of a reason." As the hours passed, Aaliyah moved about the small apartment with a graceful, quiet efficiency, preparing a simple broth and checking his vitals with a practiced hand. Min-Seok watched her every move, his intense eyes following her as if she were the only light in a dark room. He felt a strange, quiet peace beginning to settle over him, a feeling that was entirely foreign to the ruthless mafia boss he had once been. He didn't know that across the city, his step-siblings were already drinking to his memory, toasted by the very wealth they had stolen from him. He didn't know that he was a dead man to the rest of the world. In this small, warm space, he was simply a man being nursed back to health by a woman whose kindness was the first lesson in his new life. Min-Seok Kim, the lion of the underworld, was gone. In his place was a nameless guest, leaning on the strength of a nurse who had saved his life, not for his money or his power, but simply because his heart was still beating. He drifted back to sleep that evening, not to the dreams of conquest and blood that usually haunted him, but to the steady, comforting sound of Aaliyah humming a soft melody in the kitchen, his only anchor in a world he no longer knew. The morning sun rose over Seoul, but it did not carry the warmth of a new beginning. Instead, it shone with a cold, clinical brilliance upon the glass towers of the Kim conglomerate. Inside the executive boardroom, the air was sterile and heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and old money. Tae-ho Park stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his dark turtleneck replaced by a sharp, slate-gray suit that signaled his transition from the shadows to the spotlight. He moved with a restless, lean energy, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the leather surface of an empty chair. The seat that had, until 48 hours ago, belonged to Min-Seok Kim. Beside him, Yoonjae Park was the picture of poised, calculating elegance. Her black blazer was buttoned tight, her shoulder-length hair falling in a sleek, perfect line that framed a face of practiced mourning. She held a stack of legal documents with a steady hand, her delicate features settled into a mask of solemnity that hid the triumphant fire burning in her eyes. To the bank of lawyers and board members gathered before them, they were the grieving survivors of a tragic mountain accident. To each other, they were the architects of a new world order. "The search teams have concluded their second sweep of the ravine," Tae-ho announced, his voice carrying a practiced tremor of sorrow that didn't quite reach his twinkling, mischievous eyes. "Given the severity of the crash and the rising waters of the river below, they have officially declared that there is no possibility of survival. My brother, the chairman, is gone." A heavy silence followed, a vacuum that Yoonjae was quick to fill with the cold iron of her resolve. She stepped forward, the grace of her movements hiding the predatory instinct beneath. "In accordance with our father's contingency trust and the absence of a direct heir, the responsibility of the Kim legacy now falls to us. We cannot allow the empire Min-Seok built to falter in his absence. We are here to ensure a seamless transition of power." As the lawyers began to circulate the final inheritance papers, Tae-ho leaned back, his fit, lean build relaxing into the high-backed leather throne. He watched the pens hit the paper, each signature a nail in the coffin of his stepbrother's memory. He felt a surge of arrogant adrenaline. For years, he had lived in the shadow of Min-Seok's athletic, commanding presence, dismissed as the lesser sibling. Now, with a few drops of ink, he had inherited the crown he didn't have the strength to earn, but had the cunning to steal. The siblings didn't wait for the ink to dry before they began the systematic dismantling of Min-Seok's inner circle. Loyalists were reassigned to remote provincial offices. Personal assets were liquidated into private offshore accounts. They moved with a ruthless efficiency that would have almost made Min-Seok proud had he been there to witness his own erasure. By noon, the digital displays in the lobby had already been updated, the name Min-Seok Kim replaced by a generic corporate logo, a ghost being exorcised from his own machine. Later that evening, the siblings retreated to Min-Seok's private penthouse, a place they had once been forbidden to enter without an invitation. Tae-ho threw himself onto the designer's sofa, kicking his feet up on a marble coffee table that cost more than a common worker's yearly salary. He uncorked a bottle of vintage cognac from Min-Seok's private collection, the amber liquid catching the light as he poured 2 generous glasses. "He was so certain of his invincibility," Tae-ho mocked, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He raised his glass toward the panoramic view of the city, a view that now belonged entirely to him. He died in the mud like a dog while we drink his finest reserve in his own sky. It's almost poetic, isn't it, Yoonjae? Yoonjae walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. She didn't share her brother's loud bravado. Her triumph was quieter, deeper. She thought of the ghastly accident they had orchestrated and felt no sting of conscience. In her mind, power was not a birthright. It was a prize for the most patient hunter. She turned back to the room, her upright posture exuding a cold authority that seemed to fill the vacuum Min-Seok had left behind. "The world has a short memory, brother," she said, her voice a sharp, polished blade. "By next week, the name Min-Seok Kim will be a footnote in a financial report. We have the inheritance. We have the title. He is at the bottom of a ravine, and we are on top of the world." They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and final in the quiet penthouse. They laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed that celebrated the death of a king. They were so consumed by the brilliance of their own stolen crown that they couldn't see the flicker of a distant light in a small apartment across the city. They truly believed that the man they had betrayed was gone, his memory buried under layers of steel and mountain dirt. They didn't know that while they were toasting to a dead man, the sleeping lion was breathing in the scent of lavender and antiseptic, his broken body being mended by a woman they would never have deigned to notice. The Park siblings had stolen the crown, but they had forgotten one fundamental truth about the man they called brother. Min-Seok Kim had never lost a war, and he had never left a betrayal unpaid. As they drank to their victory, the clock was already ticking toward the day the ghost would return to reclaim what was his. The weeks that followed passed in a blurred sequence of sunrise and shadow, as the man who had once ruled through fear learned to exist through grace. In the quiet confines of Aaliyah's modest apartment, Min-Seok's recovery was not just a mending of bone and skin, but a slow dismantling of a soul he no longer remembered possessing. The stern, serious mask that had defined his life as a mafia boss began to soften, the chiseled lines of his jaw relaxing as the constant threat of betrayal was replaced by the simple, rhythmic hum of domestic life. Aaliyah became the sun around which his new, smaller world orbited. She moved through the rooms with a slim, capable strength, her blue scrubs often exchanged for soft, oversized sweaters after her long shifts at the hospital. She taught him the things his previous life had never allowed: how to enjoy the steam rising from a home-cooked bowl of soup, how to listen to the rain without calculating the risk of a mountain road, and how to find peace in silence rather than suspicion. "You're doing it again," Aaliyah said one afternoon, her voice a gentle tease. She walked into the small living room to find Min-Seok standing by the window, his strong, athletic frame tense, his piercing eyes scanning the street below with an intensity he couldn't quite explain. He looked like a king standing guard over a kingdom of one. He turned to her, his dark hair falling slightly over the bandage that still sat above his brow. "Doing what?" "Looking like you're waiting for an army to arrive," she replied, stepping closer to him. She didn't flinch at his imposing presence. Instead, she reached up and adjusted the collar of the simple cotton shirt she had bought for him. "There's no one coming, Min-Seok. At least, no one who wants to hurt you. Try to breathe." Min-Seok looked down at her, struck by the natural beauty of her soft, defined features. In the void of his memory, her face was his only map. "I feel like I should be doing something more, like I'm missing a purpose." "Your purpose right now is to heal," she said firmly, her hand lingering on his arm. "The world can wait." As his strength returned, Aaliyah began to involve him in the small tasks of her day. She taught him how to chop vegetables, laughing when his large, powerful hands fumbled with the delicate knife. She showed him how to tend to the few potted plants on her balcony, explaining the patience required for something to grow. Min-Seok, who had once managed thousands of lives and billions of one with a single cold command, found himself focused entirely on the survival of a single orchid. He discovered that he liked the way her curly hair caught the afternoon light, and how her laughter seemed to fill the hollow spaces in his chest, where his identity used to be. One evening, as they sat together on the small sofa, the television murmured softly in the background. Aaliyah was leafing through a medical journal, her stethoscope draped over the back of the chair, while Min-Seok watched her with an intensity that had shifted from authority to something far more vulnerable. "Why did you stay with me that night?" he asked suddenly. "You didn't know who I was. I was just a bloody stranger in a suit that cost more than your car. You could have just called the police and left." Aaliyah put her journal down, her gaze meeting his with a warmth that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "As a nurse, I'm trained to see the person, not the suit. And as a woman, I saw someone who looked like they had been carrying the weight of the world alone for far too long. I couldn't just walk away from that." Min-Seok felt a strange, tightening sensation in his throat. He reached out, his hand hesitant before he covered hers. Her skin was warm, a grounding reality that made the ghosts in his mind recede. In this simple life, he wasn't a Kim or a boss. He was just a man, and for the first time in a life he couldn't remember, he felt seen. "I don't know who I was before," he whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "But I think I like who I am when I'm with you better." Aaliyah didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, the scent of her lavender soap a soft, intoxicating presence. Maybe the accident wasn't just a tragedy, Min-Seok. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In that moment, the sleeping lion felt a flicker of something more powerful than any empire he had ever commanded. He was falling for her, not for what she could do for his power, but for the way she had mended his spirit without asking for anything in return. He watched her smile, a soft, compassionate expression that made him forget the dark mountain pass and the cold metal of the wreckage. He was a nameless guest in a small apartment, living a life of simplicity he would have once scoffed at, but as he looked at Aaliyah, he realized he had never been richer. He didn't know that miles away, his siblings were burning through his fortune, or that the lion was being hunted by the very people who shared his blood. He only knew that for the first time, he was safe, and that the woman holding his hand was the only kingdom he ever wanted to rule. The peace of the small apartment was shattered not by a scream, but by the low, flickering hum of the evening news. It was a Saturday, the kind of quiet evening where the only sound should have been the steam whistling from the kettle and the soft rustle of Aaliyah's medical journals. Min-Seok sat on the edge of the sofa, his athletic frame relaxed, his intense eyes following Aaliyah as she moved through the kitchen, humming a melody that had become the soundtrack to his recovery. Then, a name cut through the air like a jagged blade. Breaking news. The board of directors for Kim International has officially confirmed the appointment of Tae-ho Park as the new chairman, following the tragic death of Min-Seok Kim. Min-Seok froze. The tea towel in his hand dropped to the floor. On the television screen, a high-definition image flashed. Tae-ho Park, dressed in a dark turtleneck and a sharp blazer, was standing before a podium, his face a mask of practiced grief that didn't quite hide the predatory twinkle in his eyes. Beside him stood Yoonjae Park, her black blazer sleek and professional, her smile a thin, calculating line of triumph. The sound of the television seemed to distort, warping into the screech of tires and the violent crunch of metal. Min-Seok's breath hitched. Suddenly, the scent of Aaliyah's lavender candles was replaced by the acrid, choking smell of gasoline and burning rubber. He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his dark, wavy hair as the fog in his mind began to swirl with violent intensity. "Min-Seok, what is it?" Aaliyah's voice was distant, a faint echo against the roar of a memory he couldn't stop. The flashes came in rapid fire, a hand reaching into the undercarriage of a car, the metallic snip of a wire, the sound of Tae-ho's arrogant laugh echoing in a marble hallway. "He thinks our blood is diluted. Tonight, we show him that diluted blood can still drown a king." Min-Seok's eyes flew open, their vacant glassiness replaced by a terrifying, piercing clarity. He wasn't just a guest. He wasn't just a man who liked orchids and quiet mornings. He was a lion who had been hunted by his own pride. He saw the face of the mechanic he had once trusted, the ledger of his billion-dollar empire, and the cold, unyielding weight of the navy suit he had worn on the night the world ended. "Min-Seok, look at me." Aaliyah was in front of him now, her slim, strong hands gripping his shoulders, her face full of the compassionate concern that had first saved him. He looked at her, but for the first time he didn't see just his savior. He saw the contrast between her world and the one he had left behind. The intensity in his gaze was so sharp, so authoritative, that Aaliyah instinctively took a half step back. The sleeping lion wasn't just stirring, he was clawing his way back to the surface. "Ti-ho," Min-Seok rasped, the name tasting like ash and iron on his tongue. His chiseled jaw was set in a stern, serious line that looked as if it had been carved from stone. "Yoonjae." "You remember," Aaliyah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared and his presence seemed to grow until he filled the small room with an air of lethal authority. The man who had fumbled with a vegetable knife was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he could dismantle a city with a single word. Min-Seok stood up, his movement fluid and powerful. He looked at the television, where his step-siblings were now toasting to their new era with vintage champagne. The betrayal burned in his chest, a cold, white-hot fire that scorched away the peace he had found in Aaliyah's arms. "They did this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "They didn't just want the money, they wanted me dead." He turned to Aaliyah, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes wavered. He saw the stethoscope on the table, the simple life she had shared with him, and the natural beauty of the woman who had asked for nothing but his health. He realized with a jolt of agony that his memory was a double-edged sword. It gave him back his power, but it threatened to steal the only peace he had ever known. "Aaliyah," he started, his voice cracking. "I know who you are now," she said softly, her eyes searching his. She had seen the news too. She knew the face of the man on the screen. "You're him, the one they call the boss." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a billion-dollar legacy and a life of blood. The trigger had been pulled, and the bullet was already in flight. The ghost in the wreckage had found his name, but as Min-Seok looked at the woman who had nursed him back from the brink, he knew that the man he was about to become might be someone she could no longer hold. The haunting flashes of his old life weren't just memories, they were a summons. The king had been called back to his throne, and the vengeance he was about to unleash would leave no room for the simplicity of the home he had grown to love. The transition in Min-Seok's mind was not a gentle awakening. It was an industrial furnace roar. As he stood in Aaliyah's living room, the flickering television screen acted as a lightning rod, grounding the fractured electrical currents of his memory. The sleeping lion did not merely stir. He tore through the cage of amnesia with a ferocity that turned his blood to ice. Every detail of his life as the chairman of the Kim syndicate returned with a crushing weight. The scent of Cuban cigars in his mahogany-lined study, the weight of the gold watch he'd been wearing during the crash, and the precise, cold calculations he made every morning before the sun rose. But with the power came the poison. The betrayal by Ti-ho and Yoonjae was no longer a series of blurry flashes. It was a crystal-clear recording playing on a loop in his mind. He remembered the dinner 3 nights before the accident, where Yoonjae had smiled over her wine glass, her soft features hiding the fact that she was mentally measuring him for a coffin. He remembered the way Ti-ho had patted him on the back, his mischievous eyes glittering with the knowledge that the diluted blood was about to strike. The depth of their treachery was a cavernous void, a realization that he had been hunted by the very people he had allowed to share his name and his table. Min-Seok's posture underwent a terrifying transformation. The slight, vulnerable slouch he had adopted during his recovery vanished, replaced by a rigid military precision. His athletic frame seemed to expand, his shoulders squaring as if preparing to carry the mantle of his empire once more. He looked down at his hands that had lately learned to chop vegetables and tend to orchids, and clenched them into white-knuckled fists. The strength in his well-toned arms wasn't for healing anymore. It was for reclaiming. "Min-Seok," Aaliyah's voice was a whisper, a soft plea for the man she had grown to love to stay. But when he turned his head to look at her, she saw a stranger. His eyes, which had been warm and searching just hours ago, were now piercing and intense, burning with an air of absolute authority that made the small apartment feel like a prison cell. The stern, serious mask had returned, carved from the same stone that had made him the most feared man in Seoul. The head injury, once a mark of his fragility, was now just a battle scar on a warrior who had returned from the dead. "They think I am a ghost," Min-Seok said, his voice no longer raspy or hesitant. It was deep, resonant, and dripped with a lethal chill. They think they can sit in my chair and drink my wine while I rot in a ravine. Aaliyah took a step toward him, her hands reaching out in a gesture of instinctive care, but she stopped when she saw the coldness in his jawline. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to remind them why I am the head of the Kim family," he replied, his gaze fixed on the television where Tae-ho was currently being toasted by a crowd of sycophants. "I am going to show them that a king does not die simply because his heart stops for a moment." He walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. In his mind, he was already mapping out the loyalists who could be reached, the hidden accounts his siblings didn't know about, and the exact sequence of the fall he would orchestrate for the parks. The simplicity of the life Aaliyah had offered him, the soups, the music, the quiet mornings, felt like a dream he was forced to wake up from. He felt the pull of his old life, a dark, magnetic force that demanded he return to the shadows and the blood. Yet, as he caught his reflection in the dark glass, he saw Aaliyah standing behind him, her blue scrubs a stark contrast to the darkness of his thoughts. A pang of agony twisted in his chest. He realized that the man he was becoming again was a man who couldn't exist in her world. The lion had awakened, but the price of his awakening was the peace he had found in her arms. "Min-Seok," she said, her voice trembling but brave. "You don't have to go back to being that man. You survived, you have a new life here." He turned back to her, and for a fleeting second, the nameless guest flickered in his eyes before the boss took over completely. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb grazing her soft cheek with a tenderness that felt like a goodbye. "They tried to kill me, Aaliyah," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "If I don't go back, they will never stop, and if they ever find out you saved me, they will come for you too." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His survival wasn't just a miracle, it was a threat to her safety. As long as Tae-ho and Yoon-jae sat on his throne, Aaliyah Carter was a target. The lion hadn't just awakened to take back his crown. He had awakened to protect the only person who had ever treated him like a human being rather than a transaction. He pulled his hand away, the authoritative mask locking into place. The faithful day had arrived, and with it, the end of his innocence. He wasn't the broken man from the wreckage anymore. He was Min-Seok Kim, and the world was about to find out that the grave couldn't hold him. He looked at the door, then back at Aaliyah, the fire of vengeance and the weight of his legacy finally consuming the quiet life they had shared. The hunt had begun. The transition from the warmth of Aaliyah's small apartment to the cold, glass and steel shadows of Seoul's financial district required a calculated precision that only a man of Min-Seok's background could muster. He sat at the small kitchen table, the light of a single amber lamp illuminating the sharp, chiseled lines of his jaw. He was no longer the wandering ghost. He was a commander preparing for an asymmetric strike. To re-enter his world undetected, he needed to bypass the high-tech biometric surveillance and the newly hired loyalists now patrolling the Kim Towers. He needed a phantom's entrance, and for that, he needed Aaliyah. Aaliyah stood across from him, her medical bag open on the counter. She watched him with a mixture of trepidation and unwavering loyalty. To the world, she was just a nurse in blue scrubs, an invisible part of the city's working class who moved through secure buildings without a second glance. To Min-Seok, she was his Trojan horse. "The executive gala is being held at the Grand Orchid Plaza to celebrate the merger," Min-Seok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that commanded the room. "Tae-ho and Yoon-jae have doubled the security, but they expect a frontal assault from a rival family. They don't expect a medical emergency from within." He laid out a blueprint of the plaza, drawn entirely from memory, on a paper napkin. He pointed to the service elevators used by medical standby teams and the blind spots in the kitchen corridors where the cameras lagged by 3 seconds. Aaliyah listened, her natural beauty tempered by a new, grim resolve. She understood the plan. She would enter as a part of the contracted medical standby team for the event, carrying the supplies Min-Seok needed to regain access to his private biometric server, a hardware bypass key he had hidden in a secure safe deposit box months before the accident. "If they catch you, Aaliyah," Min-Seok began, his piercing eyes softening for a fleeting second. He reached out, his large hand hesitating before covering hers. The athletic power in his frame was tethered by a sudden, sharp fear for her safety. "They won't," she interrupted, her voice steady and full of the same strength she had used to pull him from the wreckage. "I've spent my life being invisible to people like them. I can get in, and I can get you what you need. Just promise me that when this is over, the man I saved is the one who comes back." Min-Seok didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his grip on her hand. Under the cover of a rainy Tuesday, the silent retribution began. While Tae-ho and Yoon-jae were busy rehearsing their victory speeches, Aaliyah used her credentials to secure a temporary shift at the plaza. Meanwhile, Min-Seok, dressed in a nondescript dark hoodie that hid his authoritative features, moved through the city's underground like a predator in the tall grass. With Aaliyah acting as his eyes and ears inside the perimeter, Min-Seok successfully intercepted the encrypted signal from his server. That night, in the back of a shadowed car, Min-Seok watched the digital upload bar on his laptop hit 100%. He now had backdoor access to the company's internal accounts, the private security feeds, and the undeniable evidence of the siblings' embezzlement and sabotage. He looked at Aaliyah, who sat beside him in the dark, her hand resting on his arm. The lion was at the gates, silent and invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to tear the stolen crown away. The retributive strike was no longer a hope, it was an inevitability. The Grand Orchid Plaza pulsed with the heartbeat of high society, a symphony of clinking crystal and orchestrated laughter. Under the dazzling light of crystal chandeliers, Tae-ho and Yoon-jae Park stood at the center of the ballroom, the undisputed heirs to a throne built on blood and betrayal. Tae-ho looked every bit the modern king in a tailored tuxedo, his smirk radiating a smug, untouchable confidence as he toasted to the board of directors. Beside him, Yoon-jae was a vision of cold elegance in a black silk gown, her eyes scanning the room with the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who had finally claimed the forest. "To the future," Tae-ho announced, raising his glass high. "To a Kim International that is stronger, leaner, and finally free of the shadows of the past." But as the room erupted in applause, the massive digital screens behind the podium, meant to display the new corporate logo, suddenly flickered into static. The air in the ballroom chilled instantly. The upbeat music died, replaced by a low, rhythmic thud that sounded like a heartbeat. Then, the static cleared, and the screen didn't show a logo. It showed a grainy, high-definition video of a darkened garage, a mechanic's hands cutting a brake line, and the unmistakable voices of Tae-ho and Yoon-jae discussing the ghastly accident that would secure their fortune. The silence that followed was deafening. Tae-ho's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Yoon-jae's face, usually so poised, drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. "Who is doing this?" Tae-ho roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate fear. "Shut it down." "The dead don't stay silent forever, Tae-ho." The voice didn't come from the speakers. It came from the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking down the center aisle was a man the world had mourned for weeks. Min-Seok Kim moved with a terrifying, athletic grace, his strong build filling out a charcoal suit that seemed to radiate authority. The scar on his forehead was a jagged badge of survival, and his piercing eyes were locked on his siblings with a lethal, focused intensity. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a god of retribution. "Min-Seok," Yoon-jae whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the podium to steady herself. It's impossible." "You were always better at math than at loyalty, Yoon-jae," Min-Seok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that echoed to the furthest corners of the room. He stepped onto the stage, the sheer power of his presence forcing his siblings to shrink back. "You calculated the height of the cliff, the speed of the car, and the depth of the water, but you forgot to calculate the strength of the woman who saved me." He turned slightly and reached out his hand toward the side entrance. Aaliyah Carter stepped into the light. She had traded her blue scrubs for a floor-length emerald gown, her curly hair framing a face that glowed with a natural beauty that put every diamond in the room to shame. She walked to Min-Seok's side, her slim but strong hand sliding into his. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the queen consort of a reclaimed empire. "This is Aaliyah Carter," Min-Seok announced, his stern features softening for a fleeting second as he looked at her. She found a homeless man in the mud and gave him a reason to live. You found a brother and gave him a reason to kill. Min-Seok turned back to the siblings, his expression hardening into stone. The police are already at the gates. The evidence of your sabotage, the embezzlement, and the attempted murder has already been sent to every major news outlet in the country. You didn't just lose the inheritance, Tiho. You lost your lives. As security teams, loyalists who had been waiting for the lion's signal, moved in to restrain the Park siblings, the shocking twist was not just Min-Seok's return. It was the way he looked at Aaliyah. The cold, ruthless mafia boss had died in that ravine, and in his place stood a man who finally understood that power was nothing without a soul worth protecting. He led Aaliyah to the center of the stage, ignoring the flashes of the cameras and the gasps of the elite. In the wreckage of his old life, he had found something far more precious than a billion-dollar legacy. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, a silent promise made in the middle of his greatest victory. The king had returned to his throne, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't sitting on it alone. Aaliyah saved his life, but he saved her future. Tap the heart if you believe true love can change even the coldest heart, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never lost. Thanks for staying with us, and please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more amazing stories. Stay blessed and stay beautiful.